So this is going to be a really exciting video that was prompted by a troll that I had recently. This video is going to be the differences as noted by me. This is not fucking science. This is not like an end-all be-all, but these are the key differences in PTSD and complex PTSD. This is something I've discussed several times on Complexity's podcast, and if you haven't heard the podcast, or if you don't want to listen to a whole podcast, I'm going to sum it up right here, because I think there is a very large misconception that they are the same, or that they're similar. I mean, they have vague similarities, and the similarities are the P, the T, and the S, and the D sometimes. D's not always there. But yeah, I think the problem here is that PTSD as a diagnosis is still very new. Not a lot of doctors are used to including that in their repertoire. I mean, Pete Walker wrote his book, I think it came out in like 2013, so that was only, what, like 5 years ago? So we're on the fucking cutting edge, people. No, yeah, somebody was just telling me, like, oh, you're no different than me, and you're not special. And I don't think that people with complex PTSD are trying to say, like, oh, I'm special. Like, it's not about fucking being special. It's just different. Number one difference that I've noticed, and the reason why I didn't feel like my original diagnosis of PTSD, which I got 5 years ago, was accurate, was because people with PTSD usually have flashbacks. You know, like in the movies when they do the classic soldier going to Afghanistan or wherever he went, and she could be she. But you know, I'm talking like some, the Punisher. The new Punisher movie did a really great job of, well, I wouldn't say really great job. They did a very fictionalized job of what I imagine PTSD to be like, where, you know, you're having flashback nightmares, you're waking up from these flashback nightmares. Sometimes they're happening during the day when they're triggered by things happening around you. You're immersed back in that image of what happened. And for me, I never had image flashbacks. So that was a really big difference for me. I have emotional flashbacks where when I get triggered by something, I get the feeling, the emotion of being in the original traumatic situation. So a lot of the times when I'm triggered, I feel like I'm at my dad's house, where I felt like a prisoner, where he was a narcissistic sociopath that was controlling and manipulating and gaslighting me for 7 years. So I am instantly thrust back to the feeling of being there again. Logically, I know that I'm not there, but psychologically, I feel like I'm there. I don't see it around me, but inside my body feels that way. My heart races, I get scared, I panic, I have that fight or flight response, I want to run. I think you get the idea. So, main difference I've noticed in PTSD and Cptsd is PTSD has visual flashbacks that I'm sure have a lot of emotional response as well. Cptsd has emotional flashbacks and less imagery. And I think that's because people who have Cptsd, this will lead me to my next point, Cptsd usually, not always, but most of the time, I'm not going to try to give it a percentage, but out of the, let's say, 6 people I know who have Cptsd, only one of them got it differently than this. Most people get Cptsd from early childhood or adolescent trauma, prolonged trauma. It's not one event or 2 events, it is a lifestyle. You grow up in an abusive household. You are abused repeatedly as a child or adolescent. The difference being with PTSD, it often happens later in life after you've had a chance to establish your identity after you have become a teenager or an adult, and it's usually one event or a series of similar events. You go to war, you are held prisoner, you get into a terrible accident, you are the victim of some kind of violent act. So the difference being Cptsd, complex PTSD, and why they call it complex is because it doesn't have one source of origin. So it's more complex to treat and complex to understand and complex to deal with. I don't want to confuse anyone and make them think that I'm saying it's worse or it's more intense or that I'm fucking better than anyone, because I'm definitely not saying that. That's your fucking ego and you need to put it away. They are different, equal, just as anything else in reality is equal. We're all one and we all have our own shit. Nobody's trauma is worse than anyone else. So, Cptsd usually happens in early childhood, and it is prolonged exposure to trauma. It can happen later in life if you are in a very long-term abuse situation. So I'm talking years, not days or months, decades. If you're in a conflict zone, like all the children growing up in Syria right now are probably going to grow up to have Cptsd because they're growing up in a war zone, a trauma zone in their early childhood. And it's reconditioning their brain. That is what post-traumatic stress does, whether it's complex or not. It reconditions your brain to think differently. I'm going to go out on a fucking limb here and say it's not a disability. Because when I think of a disability, I think of people who are permanently disabled, who have no chance of healing, you know, like some kind of disease or disability that's permanent. That we don't have medical or any kind of technology to heal. Complex PTSD and PTSD can be healed. It's 100% possible for everyone. It's a choice. It's not a choice to get PTSD or Cptsd, but it is a choice to heal and to seek therapy and to recondition your brain. It's not an easy choice. It's not an easy fucking thing to do. It's very difficult. It's very hard. And it can seem like a disability. You know, I function differently than people. But I'm not going to say that I'm disabled because I don't want to be a victim anymore, because I'm not going to continue perpetuating my own victimhood. I am healing from trauma. I am not disabled in any means. I have a lot of fucking issues, but I'm working those things out. And, yeah, so another difference. So Cptsd is different from complex PTSD is different from PTSD. Did I sum that up enough? What else do I need to tell you? What other things have I noticed? I've noticed that people with PTSD are more likely to talk about it, and there's a lot more support for people, or maybe not support, but resources. There's a lot more information on PTSD than there is Cptsd, and that's the main reason that I have started the podcast. I've started my website, and I share all the information that I'm sharing. And I try not to let my ego get in the way and say, when I correct people and say, look, I don't have PTSD. I don't. And I'm not trying to raise awareness for PTSD, because a lot of people who have it are doing that, or Veterans Affairs people are doing it, or doctors are doing it. You know, we've had the last 3 to 4 decades where people have really been talking about it, and complex PTSD is not there yet. And I'm not, again, this isn't about my ego or me being worse or better or anything like that. I'm simply saying that the reason that I started my podcast and the reason that I tell my story is because I want to raise awareness for complex PTSD, because no one is really doing that. I mean, I say no one because whenever I went to look for resources, I found 1,000 things for PTSD and then maybe one thing for complex PTSD. and trying to take in that information and make it my own, I can do that, but it just doesn't quite fit. And the only resource that I've found to be super helpful for me personally is Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. Until I found that, I really hadn't been able to find a whole lot of resources for things specific to complex PTSD. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I tell my story. And that's why I fucking correct people when they say, oh, I have PTSD too, or, oh, when you know, your PTSD story. I don't have PTSD. It is a different thing. It's not an egotistical thing. It's just different. It would be like saying, like, oh, I don't even want to make a comparison because that would just be off color. It's just different. My life is different than somebody who has PTSD. My trauma is different. My story is different. My healing's different. My experience is different. It's not better. It's not worse. It's not more. It's not less. It's just different. And so, through the podcast and through telling my story, I really want to make that clear. I want to make it crystal fucking clear that there is a difference between complex PTSD and Cptsd. Fucking, why do I keep saying that? There is a difference between any kind of post-traumatic stress. You either got it from a long-term traumatic situation, which is complex PTSD. So I'm making this way more complicated than it should be. It's probably because I'm tired and I'm in the middle of being triggered, but... So, you got it from long-term exposure to trauma. It reconditioned your brain over a long period of time, which means there's more to it. It's more complex. That is not to say that PTSD is not equally as traumatizing or painful or hard to deal with or debilitating. PTSD stems from one event or a series of similar events over a shorter amount of time. It has a different effect on people. The healing process is slightly different, and the way that you interact with the world is slightly different. For example, my trauma started when I was debatably in the womb, and then toddler, and then preschooler, and then it continued. I never formed an identity. So when I was in therapy and they said, let's try to find the pre-trauma you and get you back there. There is no pre-trauma me. There was just trauma. If you have PTSD, there is an identity that you formed that was changed and altered by trauma. And you can choose in therapy to go back to that identity or reclaim it in some way, or you can choose to start a new one. Totally up to you. But that is a very big difference. I do not have an identity to go back to. My identity has always been trauma. And I accept that, and I'm working to change that. You know, I'm working to have a new identity and all of the good things, but it is a difference. Have I said that enough? Are you tired of hearing me say they're different? They just are. And I'm putting this on YouTube. I'm sharing it everywhere because they're different. And because people need to know they're different. Not because my ego wants you to know that they're different, but because I think sharing false information and not having accurate information for yourself is not helpful. It perpetuates... Oh my god, that's a really big spider. It perpetuates ignorance, and it keeps us from healing. If you don't have all the information, how are you supposed to heal yourself or help those around you heal? How are you supposed to break abuse cycles? How are you supposed to overcome your trauma if you don't fully grasp the situation? And if you're under the impression that PTSD and Cptsd are the same, then maybe you're mistaken, because they're quite different. And there is science behind this. Like, it's not just my fucking personal opinion. These are my personal fucking opinions. But in the new DSM, whatever the fuck, that book that everybody loves, that gives us all labels, That book, the newest one, is going to have CPTSD and PTSD listed as something different. I don't know exactly what it's going to say, but they're separate. Therefore, if you need scientific proof, that's the scientific proof. If you don't need scientific proof, Google them and see the differences for yourself, because it's there. Rant over.